Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Margaret Nowicki from the Department of Public Information, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Today's briefing will focus on human rights and Indigenous peoples, and I'm pleased to introduce our guests. On my immediate left is Ms. Victoria Tauli-Corpuz, who is the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She is an Indigenous leader from the Kankane-Igorot people of the Cordillera region in the Philippines. To her left is National Chief Perry Bellegarde of the Assembly of First Nations in Canada. He is from the Little Black Bear First Nation and has served as Chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations and Saskatchewan Regional Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. And to his left is Ms. Christina Koch. She is the director and co-founder of the Julian Cho Society. She has been an activist for Maya land rights and forest conservation since 2003. She works with Maya villages of Toledo in southern Belize to secure indigenous land rights and represents the Maya in negotiations with the government of Belize. The guests will make short introductory statements and then we'll take your questions. And I'd like to begin by calling on Ms. Tauli-Corpuz. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. I would just like to focus on the issues of Indigenous peoples regarding the post-2015 development agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. It is very regrettable to say that out of the 17 goals and 169 targets which were adopted by the Open-Ended Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, there is no reference to Indigenous peoples in the goals, and in the targets there are only 2 references, 2 out of 169, and I think this does not speak well of how states of the United Nations are dealing with the specific problems and visions of Indigenous peoples on sustainable development. There are already several evidences which show that if the rights of Indigenous peoples are respected, they will have a bigger chances of contributing in solving some of the crises that we face today, such as the climate change crisis, for instance. Data shows that in countries where Indigenous peoples' rights to their forests are protected, the forests where they stay are less deforested than the forests which are controlled or managed by the state, whether these are in national parks or conservation areas. The data that has been released by the World Resources Institute and the Rights and Resources Institute would show that in Brazil, the forests maintained by Indigenous peoples are 7% less deforested than the forest controlled by the government. And in the same vein, in Guatemala, in Petén, for instance, they have also shown that the forests maintained by Indigenous peoples are 20 times less deforested than the other forests sustained by the governments. And these forests that are sustained are sequestering around 37.7 billion tons of carbon in the ground, which is 29 times bigger than all the emissions released by public transportation all over the world. So this is the kind of evidence that's slowly coming into the picture, which shows that respect of Indigenous peoples' rights will enable Indigenous peoples to contribute significantly to solving some of the world's problems, whether in the environment arena or in the development arena. And therefore, I would, as the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous peoples' rights, I would really highly recommend that when states come together to develop the means of implementation to attain sustainable development goals, Indigenous peoples' human rights will also be considered in this in providing for this means, as well as when technology transfer and development, for instance, are going to be talked about, that the traditional technologies and knowledge systems of Indigenous peoples be valued as well. And finally, that there will be indicators developed that will reflect the indicators that Indigenous peoples would like to see there. For instance, the amount of land that are collectively owned and managed by Indigenous peoples, how are these recognized by the states? That's just one example of some of these indicators that have been presented by Indigenous peoples in the post-2015 development processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to call on Chief Bellegarde. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts. And for us as Indigenous peoples in Canada, we always say, there's 634 First Nations communities. We represent about 1.4 million people that are there. And in our territory, we always talk about, as Indigenous peoples, we have over 58 different languages, our nations in Canada. And Canada is a rich country. It's rated, according to the United Nations Human Development Index, anywhere from 6 to 8 or 9 is high up. But when you apply the same indices to Indigenous peoples in Canada, we're 63rd. That's the gap that exists in Canada. And so everywhere I go, whether I be in Canada or through United Nations forums, I try to utilize whatever mechanisms are there to devise strategies and to push Canada to respect inherent rights, Indigenous rights, to help close the gap. That's what it's all about. And I always tell people back home in the nation state called Canada, if you can't get your head around inherent rights or Aboriginal rights or treaty rights, get your head around the business case. There's a high socioeconomic cost to poverty, and this gap represents overcrowded housing. This gap represents thousands of children, Indigenous children in provincial care. This gap represents 93 communities with boil water advisories in Canada. This represents high disproportionate numbers of Indigenous peoples in jails. And so this gap has to close. There's discriminatory funding when it comes to education on reserve, $6,500 per child on reserve. In the provincial school systems, it's almost 11,000. In the French school systems, it's almost 20,000. So there's all these things that need to be addressed. And when we start coming to the United Nations forums, we call on Canada to respect Indigenous rights. And we always point to the fact, even James Anaya, when he came out, the former rapporteur, he pointed out the relationship with the nation state and Indigenous peoples is unnecessarily adversarial. It's unnecessarily adversarial to the point where Canada spent $106 million on lawyers fighting and suppressing our rights as Indigenous peoples. And so things that we utilize, I come to the United Nations forums because Canada has signed on and is part of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so we call on them to respect things that they're part of, so that they don't do anything to lessen or hurt. Because Canada can be a shining example to the world if they embrace Indigenous people's rights. Because we always know, we say we have our own land, our own laws, our own languages, our own people, and our own identifiable forms of government. Things that qualify for the inherent right to self-determination. And so right now, that's not really being totally respected. We still have this gap that needs to be closed. We've suffered the cultural genocide via the residential school system in Canada. We're still suffering under the 1876 Indian Act, federal piece of legislation. And so we've got to move beyond those things now. And so my statement earlier on today, and points out Canada will say something to the world, but back home they don't follow their own Supreme Court of Canada decision. And I pointed that out in the Chilcotin case. The Supreme Court of Canada recognizes Aboriginal rights and title. I'm saying they need to start following their own Supreme Court of Canada decision. They need to start respecting and not be afraid of free, prior, and informed consent, because it's basically when we work together as Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in nation-state governments, this gap that I talk about has to close. And it's only by really respecting each other's diversity, but respecting each other's rights as Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, that we're going to work together to close this gap. So those are my comments this morning. And I made some statements earlier on as well in the forum as it relates to how Canada as a nation state deals with Indigenous rights, because there's an issue that we still have to deal with. And I always talk about assumed crown sovereignty, assumed crown jurisdiction. And even people are starting to look at this thing called the doctrine of discovery, and as an illegal racist doctrine. And that's a premise where we've got to really start thinking and looking at as well between Indigenous peoples and nation states, because that's the premise, and that we've got to look at challenging in a respectful way. Because in our territories, we always talk about peaceful coexistence and mutual respect between our peoples. to mutually benefit and share the land and resource wealth from Mother Earth that has to give us. And so we got to close that gap, and we can only do that by working together. Okay?
Thank you very much. Ms. Koch, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I am Christina Koch. I'm actually a woman from southern Belize. I bring my greetings from my people, the Akchi and the Mopan Maya people of southern Belize. What I'd like to share with you is over 3 decades, my communities, the Maya communities of southern Belize, the Akchi and the Mopan Maya, 38 communities in particular, have been fighting a very hard battle to secure rights and recognition and respect to our ancestral territories. And over the last 3 decades, we have tried every means that we can. We've tried to sit with our state to try to come to a peaceful resolution. We've tried the legal system, the legal strategy. And today I'm very hopeful, and I'm very excited to share with you that at the highest court, the Caribbean Court of Justice, after an unbroken chain of decisions from lower courts that affirm our rights as Indigenous people to our lands, the final appellate court for Belize has decided in favor of the Maya people and have affirmed that Maya land tenure exists in southern Belize and that the Maya people have rights to the lands and resources that they currently use and occupy, and that these rights are protected under the Constitution of Belize, free from discrimination and equal to any other form of property rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution of Belize. Further, the court also affirmed that the government must cease and desist from any further destruction, any further interference, any further use of our land that might affect the use and enjoyment of those lands by my people. In addition to that, the court also, what we have learned as Maya people in southern Belize is that states, like my colleague here said, states often make promises and sign on to declarations and even receive judgments from courts that are not translated as reality on the ground. And so we've asked the highest court, the Caribbean Court of Justice, and they have accepted to provide supervision throughout the implementation of the recent decision that was handed down. That is very favorable for the Maya people. We're very happy with that. Another quite precedent-setting decision that was brought down recently, just a few days ago, is that the court also gave damages and costs to us as Maya people, not just moral harm, but physical harm that was done to our communities by the bulldozing of our crops, the destruction of our rainforests, the destruction of our watersheds, all of these done by outside concessions granted by the state either to do logging, oil exploration, and many other forms of development that did not seek the free, prior, informed consent of our communities. This case is very important for the Maya people, but not just for the Maya people, for the young state of Belize and for, I believe, the rest of the world where Indigenous communities are looking at securing recognition and rights to those lands that they have long used and occupied. The difference with my communities is that we've never ceased to occupy our lands. We've held continuous occupation. And as much as we have been dragged through the courts, we can now attest that the government has finally accepted that they were wrong and that they will finally get on the right side of history with the Maya people and put affirmative measures in place, mechanisms that will protect our rights as Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now take your questions. Please introduce yourselves to our guests. Matthew?
Matthew Lee, UNPFII Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for this briefing. I had wanted to ask about two actual Canada-specific issues. One has to do with these oil sands developments and how they impact on Native people's rights and what you think the government is. That I'm not sure if the litigation cost that you raised incorporates that, but and also I wanted to ask one thing about Australia, which I've heard a lot throughout the forum, which is these moves by the Prime Minister to close down far-flung Aboriginal communities. And I wanted to know whether the Special Rapporteur is going to visit there and what you think of it. Thank you.
Go ahead, please. Yes, please.
Just regarding the oil sands, it's even larger in Canada. It's all about energy. It's not only the oil sands in Alberta. There's uranium in northern Saskatchewan. There's the whole pipeline issue that's going to be dialogued about. At the AFN, we're going to be organizing a national forum on energy, probably in early of 2016, because we need to bring the parties together, the federal government, provincial governments, industry, First Nations, environmentalists, because it's all about developing a sustainable strategy, a long-term sustainable development strategy. And as Indigenous peoples, we have a key role to play. And the message I'm trying to get out to governments and industry, there could be alternatives to fossil fuels. We've got to start looking at all those things, because there is only one Earth. There's only one climate. We have to be concerned with climate change and the impact on that, and finding the balance between the environment and the economy. And Indigenous peoples bring value added when they come to any boardroom, any corporate table, that yes, we want to have employment opportunities. Yes, we want to create economic wealth and growth, but we also want to make sure that the land and the water is left for future generations, and to think 7 generations down the road, and so we need to be involved. And so the tar sands is just one small piece. The oil sands developments, it's energy is really the title theme. And because of the Chilcotin case, the William case in Canada, a recent Supreme Court decision, Aboriginal rights and title are recognized and affirmed. And so the message we say to the provinces, if you want economic certainty, you want economic stability, you need to involve First Nations people every step of the way in developments, because of the duty to consult and accommodate, but as well utilizing the UN Declaration for free, prior, and informed consent. We need to work together collectively. So that's my comments on that.
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, I did have a meeting with the representatives of the Kimberley Land Council, and they also made their statements before the permanent forum. So I expressed my serious concern about the moves of the Australian government under Prime Minister Tony Abbott to displace Indigenous peoples, Aboriginal peoples from their traditional territories on the pretext that this is maintaining such territories are very expensive for the government. I think it will really be good if I can be invited by the Australian government, and that was a proposal by the Kimberley Land Council representatives whom I spoke with, that they are going to speak with the government and ask them to invite me so that I can take a deeper look into this issue.
Thank you. Other questions, please? No? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm Ann Charles, Baltic Review. I noticed in today's UN Journal that there will be a panel discussion on human rights of indigenous Crimean Tatars organized by the Permanent Mission of Ukraine on Wednesday, April 29 at 1:15 p.m. in Conference Room 5. Do you know if the Crimean Tatars attended this first week of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and were they blocked from attending the September World Conference on Indigenous People?
Please.
Yes, there are representatives of the Crimea Tatar peoples, and they met with me earlier, and they would like to set a longer meeting with me. And during the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples, indeed, Nadir Bekirov, who is one of the representatives of the Crimea Tatar peoples, was not able to attend because there were people who mugged him and took away his passport, and that has already been reported during the World Conference, and I think that's a very serious concern.
Thank you. Other questions, please? Okay, if not, I would like to thank our guests very much for joining us today, and thank all of you for coming. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.